Think about it like this. If you want to make a big head of broccoli or cauliflower, got to grow a big plant. If you want to make a big head of cabbage, got to grow a big plant. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a wonderful day. It is Monday, October 23rd here in South Georgia, and lately we've been getting a lot of questions about how to fertilize or how to feed some of the cool season veggies we're growing. So I thought it'd be a great time to do kind of a simplified feeding plan for some of these cool season veggies we have planted out here. Now, it's important to note that we're going to be keeping it really simple here. We're not going to be talking about add so many cups of this per so many row foot. We're not going to get into any kind of calculations. We're just going to be talking about general feeding strategies for certain cool season veggies. And it's also important to note that if you don't know your soil very well, it's not a bad idea to get a soil test before you plant. That way you know kind of what your baseline levels are and know how you might need to adjust that for whatever you're planting. So for example, if your soils are naturally high in phosphorus or potassium, you might not have to fertilize root veggies that much, as we'll talk about here in a minute. But if your soils are deficient in phosphorus or potassium, probably going to have to supplement. Now, we've been gardening in all these plots for several years now, so I kind of know what to expect when I plant certain veggies. We get soil tests from time to time, but I'm not getting a soil test every time I plant something different. But if you've got a new spot you're growing in for the first time, that soil test is not a bad idea. All right, so now let's dig in. For simplification purposes, we're going to take all these cool season veggies we have planted out here and put them into 3 distinct groups with different plans for each group. We're not going to talk about alliums today, so not going to talk about onions, leeks, or garlic. We have lots of videos talking about fertilization for those, and we'll be talking more about those as we plant them in November. All right, so for the purposes of this video, our 3 groups are going to be greens, heavy feeding brassicas, and root veggies. So when we're talking about greens, we're talking about things like lettuce, collards, kale, mustard greens, any of those types of greens that we're growing to eat the leaves. And then for group number 2, the heavy feeding brassicas, we're going to be talking about a lot of the things that are in this in-ground garden plot. Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. Now, from my experiences, Brussels sprouts and cabbage tend to be a little more hungry than, say, broccoli or cauliflower does. We're going to put all those in a group anyways. And then our 3rd group, root veggies, is pretty self-explanatory. That would include things like these carrots. That would also include things like parsnips, beets, would also include turnips and rutabagas if you're growing those primarily for the root. Now, before we get into some distinctions between these 3 groups, let's talk about the one thing we do for all of them, which is use a pre-plant fertilizer. Putting down a pre-plant fertilizer can solve a lot of your garden issues. Just about everything we plant, we put down a pre-plant fertilizer. I think the only thing we usually don't would be cowpeas and okra. So find you a relatively balanced, granular fertilizer. We use this Coop Grow here, which is 334, so not perfectly balanced, but close enough, and put that down either in the planting furrow if you're planting in long rows in an in-ground garden, or just sprinkle it over the entire bed like we've done in many of these raised beds here. So if you do a lot of backyard gardening, you need to think of pre-plant fertilizer as being as necessary as toilet paper. Maybe not that necessary, but it's something you should always keep on hand. Always have some of it. That way, whenever you get ready to plant something, you can always put it down. So whether you're direct seeding or transplanting, always put down some pre-plant fertilizer, whatever your balanced fertilizer of choice is. You can put it down right at planting. We do that a lot of times. In these raised beds, we kind of got these beds ready a week or 2 before we planted them. So you can do it well ahead of time as well. So now let's get back to our group distinctions and talk about how we feed these different groups, assuming we've put down some pre-plant fertilizer and these veggies are starting to grow. So starting out with the greens, we'll talk about this lettuce and other fast growing greens like the Savannah mustard over there. Oftentimes, even if you've got just okay soil, a pre-plant fertilizer is all these lettuce plants are going to need. We usually don't fertilize our lettuce a whole lot beyond that application of pre-plant fertilizer. These things grow fast, they're not in the ground a long time, and so a good solid application of pre-plant fertilizer usually does the trick. So these lettuce plants are pretty short-lived. It's a one and done harvest on these. Once we harvest all these heads, we'll flip the bed and plant something else here. Contrast that with some greens like these collards here or kale, where we're going to harvest these plants many times throughout their lifetime. And so as a result, these collard plants are going to need some additional feeding. They're eventually going to run out of juice, especially if they're in here an entire year like some of these collard plants have been. So for those longer lasting greens, the collards and the kale, you're going to have to give them more than just that pre-plant fertilizer. Now, what you give them and when you give it to them is going to vary. Everyone's situation is a little different. I haven't found that collards are particularly picky. Sometimes we give them some more coop grow. Sometimes I'll give them some AgriThrive. Sometimes I'll give them just a straight nitrogen fertilizer. And it's all about using your eyes here. If those plants look not as green as they should be, they probably ran out of juice. Feed them a little bit and then you should see the production pick back up. So now let's transition to our second group, these heavy feeding brassicas, which are going to need a little more juice. So unlike those fast growing greens where a lot of times we can get by with just the pre-plant fertilizer alone, these heavy feeding brassicas are going to need some more nitrogen. So we put down the pre-plant fertilizer when we stuck these transplants in the ground. We'll need to come back and side dress them with a high nitrogen fertilizer. Think about it like this. If you want to make a big head of broccoli or cauliflower, you got to grow a big plant. If you want to make a big head of cabbage, got to grow a big plant. If you want to make a tall stalk of Brussels sprouts, got to grow a big plant. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Brussels sprouts and the cabbage tend to be a little more hungry than the broccoli or the cauliflower. So a lot of times we'll just side dress the broccoli and the cauliflower once. We may side dress the cabbage twice. And since these Brussels sprouts are in the ground quite a while down here throughout the winter, sometimes we'll side dress those up to 3 times. And there's a lot of options out there as far as high nitrogen fertilizers go. If you don't care about being organic, calcium nitrate is a great option for these heavy feeding brassicas. In the past, we've used a lot of the NatureSafe 1300. That works really well. I think this year I may go with some blood meal and feather meal, which are both components of that NatureSafe 1300. Blood meal and feather meal are great organic sources of nitrogen as well. Lots of different things you can use. You just want to find something where that first number, the nitrogen number, is high compared to all the other numbers. And then the last group on our list we need to cover are the root veggies. So as a general rule, anytime we're growing root veggies, whether that be cool season root veggies like carrots, beets, parsnips, or warm season root veggies like potatoes and sweet potatoes, we want to give them more phosphorus and potassium than we do nitrogen. With these vegetables, we're not focused on eating what's growing above the soil. We want what's growing below the soil. And to get a nice harvest below the soil, we need more phosphorus and potassium. Now, if you've got your cool season root veggies planted in rows, really easy to side dress them with a granular fertilizer, or you can pour some liquid fertilizer alongside of them. In these round raised beds, we have our carrots planted very densely, and so side dressing really isn't an option here. Instead, we're going to have to use a water soluble fertilizer and just pour it onto the bed. Now, I don't get too crazy with the extra phosphorus and potassium, but just to give you an example here, for those carrot beds, instead of using this AgriThrive general purpose, which we might use on our collards and some of those greens that are going to be in the ground a while, we would use this fruit and flower instead because it has more potassium. But if your soils were really deficient in potassium and you had the ability to side dress, you could always come in there with something like this languinite high potassium fertilizer to give them what they need. So to recap our simplified groupings here, group 1, our fast growing greens, a lot of times our pre-plant fertilizer is all they need. Group 2, our heavy feeding brassicas, we're going to want to side dress them or give them some extra nitrogen. And then group 3, our root veggies, we want to pick a fertilizer that has more phosphorus and potassium than nitrogen. Now, what I don't want to do here is make all the beginner gardeners out there think that they've got to have all these different kind of fertilizers to grow a fall garden. That's not necessarily true. I could probably use only this coop grow or only that AgriThrive and still grow some great groceries out here without catering to the needs of individual types of vegetables. I'm just telling you what you can do to maximize your harvest with some of these vegetables that have different needs. So I hope you enjoyed that breakdown. Hopefully that gives you a nice little roadmap as far as these cool season veggies go. And then when we plant onions in the next couple of weeks, we'll be sure to talk about allium feeding. We feed those a lot like we do these heavy feeding brassicas here, but we'll be sure to cover that on another video. And as always, you can find our affiliate links and coupon codes in the description below. You can find that Coop Grow and AgriThrive fertilizer on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you want to see a really nice Brussels sprouts harvest, you can find that right here. Last year we had the best Brussels sprouts grow out we've ever had, and that was mainly a result of feeding them very well. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.